And welcome to another episode of Dean's Discussions, where I chat with interesting people. And we're joined again, thanks to popular demand, with Susan Dalgety of the Scotsman and author of her Malawi book, and also by Andrew Liddle of the Courier, who's also an author, who's Mr. Churchill, I believe.
Very good. Churchill, yeah, that's it. Yeah.
So we're joined by both of them again, and the plan today is to talk about the exodus, it seems, of SNP MPs ahead of a coming general election. How much of that is maybe due to boundary changes? How much of that is a case of jumping before they're pushed? Resurgent Scottish Labour, what would be the SNP's strategy for dealing with it, if one? And also drug deaths, which the SNP have pushed into the fore of domestic Scottish politics. Drug deaths and the proposals around decriminalisation. Now, we'll start with the SNP MPs. Andrew, you can kick us off with this, because you wrote that piece in the Courier about the move towards the exit door. So,
yeah, well, I think it's now. I think there's now 7. SNP MPs, aren't there, that have confirmed they're standing down, and I think we expect some more probably over the summer. I think that. Well, the overall point, I think, is that politicians rarely, if ever, relinquish office willingly. Mm-hmm. That normally the temptation is to cling to power, indeed beyond when it's appropriate. So I think it is very significant that we have these people announcing that they're standing down. And I think you're absolutely right in your introduction, Dean, where you said or alluded to the fact that this is related to a Scottish Labour resurgence. I think in almost all the seats where there have been resignations already announced, you can expect at the very least a very strong challenge from Scottish Labour at the general election next year. I think some, if you take someone like Stuart Hosey, for instance, he's someone who has served a long time and perhaps naturally now would be thinking of standing down.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, I think this is a really clear indication, possibly an even stronger indication than what we've seen in the polls, a kind of more real indication that the SNP really fears a Scottish Labour resurgence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, as you say, for some people, I'm not surprised. I was thinking, I know there was a big focus, a bit of a maelstrom, I think Monday last week or whenever it was, when Ian Blackford made clear he wasn't stand for re-election and all of that. But part of that is, he's been top dog in Westminster as SNP group leader. He's an ambitious man. There's not a lot more for him to do down there. You might want to move on to other things. I would be surprised if he was willing to commit to another 5 years, knowing that there was no next job, as it were, for him down there. So I was anticipating him going. Plus, of course, his boundary changes made his life a lot harder up there, because his seat basically disappeared. And the seat, I ran the statistics, so I checked out in his case, and a couple of other seats, the boundary changes that are happening, the proposed ones. Now, up in his neck of the woods, in Blackford, it would have been 42.7% of Ross-Skyn-Lochaber being merged with 100% of the Lib Dem voting Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, which would have made his projected majority from last time of, 9,443, collapsing to about 3,700. So it's a much more competitive seat right off the bat. And with only 42% of it being his old seat, incumbency wouldn't really be much of a factor. And so there's that. And of course, there are other seats. Deirdre is up in Edinburgh North and Leith, which I think is, I forget who the SNP, Deirdre Brock is the MP there. Now, her old Edinburgh North and Leith seat I'm getting a bit technical, but this one captures it. Just sums up. Whilst the boundary changes don't flip any seats, they make a hell of a lot of them very competitive, which they weren't before. Because Edinburgh North and Leith had for Brock 12,808. Her solid safe seat majority there in Edinburgh. Now 4.8% goes to Lib Dem voting Edinburgh West, and 8.6% of Edinburgh West goes to Edinburgh North and Leith. Or is it the other way around with those two numbers? But the point is her projected majority, assuming everyone votes the same way again, would only be 1,121. So it's not 12,000 becomes 1,000. I mean, I understand, standing again. Incumbency is always overrated, but you can count on maybe a couple of hundred to 1,000 votes with a good local MP, and she has a good reputation up there, from what I gather. But you're still talking a lot of seats becoming very competitive, and at a context where the SNP's vote is, well, it's went from December Christmas of last year was 51%, and now it's 34%. The drop off has been quite incredible. Not convinced it's all yes, let's vote Scottish Labour. It's time for a change, and the Tories have been in power, the SNP have been in power. I suppose it's Labour's turn. I get a lot of sort of defaulting to Scottish Labour at the moment. The deal's not been clinched. So we'll see in Scotland. I think things could still shift around quite a lot. A year is a long time. But we'll see.
A year is a long time in politics. However, it is wonderful to hear the word Scottish Labour resurgence after nearly 20 years of people telling Scottish Labour, except for a short period when Ian Gray was leader in 2010. Scottish Labour has been told that it is dead, it is finished, no one will ever vote a majority of Labour politicians in Scotland again, whether for Westminster or for Holyrood. I think the exodus from the SNP Westminster group, I think there will be several more to come. I have no idea who. I'm not privy to the inside workings of the SNP, but I'm sure the 7 are not. Will not be the final number. I think the boundary changes do have something to do with it, Ian Blackford particularly, but I think all of us know that very few politicians voluntarily give up a political career unless scandal and they're kicked out, or they know they're not going to win or not going to be selected. Very few. I could name, over the course of about 30 years, I could name probably one. So I think people like Mary Black, who's not the hardest working MP in the UK, decided that she couldn't be bothered with a really tough campaign next year, and she clearly doesn't like Westminster. She loves being a celebrity, but she doesn't like the hard work of being a constituency MP. Goodness knows where. I'm sure she'll get a great job in the third sector or somewhere. You never know, even media, but she won't be missed.
So you're saying there's a column coming in the Scotsman newspaper?
But Mary, no, I don't. Personally, I mean, everybody. Well,
or is she getting a column in the newspaper?
Well, not in the Scot. Well, I don't know. Goodness knows. No, I'm not setting a hair.
I do take your point. There's a lot. There's people not voluntarily giving up a career, but it is fun little historical fact that Mary Black is leaving in an election where her predecessor, that Douglas Alexander, might be re-entering.
Yeah.
When it was the other way around back in 2015.
Yeah, but different seats though. That's the
end. Douglas is
East Lothian.
That's the one.
Yeah.
He's a very good chance of winning.
Yeah, a few months ago was considered a Scottish Labour's #1 target seat. It probably is, but there's a few more have come in. I mean, even Edinburgh North and Leith and Edinburgh East. The Scottish Labour candidate will be chosen on July the 20th, and it's very competitive. People coming from down south, to chase that seat, which is, you know, unknown in the last 20 years. So the front runners are Chris Murray, as far as I'm aware, Chris Murray, who is Margaret Curran's son, by the way. And Sheila Gilmore, who was the MP for Edinburgh East before Tommy Shepherd. And the way the Labour Party selection works is they will both go forward. The one with the highest number of votes will get to choose which seat.
So, Andrew, it's not just Scottish Labour. The Tories have although their national polling in Scotland's not the best, they might fall slower than the SNP vote falls, and giving them a chance to hold on in the northeast, and might even pick up one with the splitting of Moray into 2 seats. They have a good chance of a pickup there.
Yeah, I think that's right, Dean. I think that particularly because the thing when you're looking at national opinion polls, obviously, is that it's easy to forget in Scotland is that actually a lot of the parties' votes are very concentrated in specific geographic areas, and I think that factor combined also with all the noise that's been going on around oil and gas, both from Labour, the SNP, there's been a lot of mixed messages in those parties about where they stand. And the Tories now, I suppose, are the only really kind of avowedly pro North Sea kind of traditional drilling type party. So I think that might have an impact there in those seats in the northeast, certainly help them hold on to the ones that they currently have, and as you say, maybe even pick some up. Obviously, I think in some of the targets that you might expect that in the last sort of 5 or 8 years that they would have had, like Stephen Flynn's seat, I think was 2017 to 2019 was a Conservative seat, wasn't it? But I think obviously the Labour resurgence, because it was a Labour seat before 2015, is probably going to make that seat very interesting. So that might limit their opportunities there. But I do definitely think that the Tories probably aren't heading for a sort of 97, 2001 style wipeout.
Not in Scotland. Not in Scotland.
No, I don't think so.
Yes, sorry, I should clarify. Yeah, nothing.
Although looking at the polls in the red wall, I think the Tories might lose all 40 of those seats. You know, Labour polling in Northern England was at 25% in one poll ahead, which would flip 40 back to Labour in England. So the English picture is very different because it's a sort of 2-horse race with Lib Dem areas as exceptions. But in Scotland, Borders northeast still seem very good bets for the Tories. Ayrshire, I never know what's going to happen in Ayrshire. There have been surprises down in Ayrshire. Central Belt, I think the SNP are in tough territory. Glasgow looks like it might be Red Clydeside again. And my own incumbent MP, Patrick Grady, I hear is standing for re-election, which has Scottish Labour thoroughly thrilled because for obvious reasons, the troubles he's had makes it very, very good for the Labour Party locally to have him as the incumbent candidate. But yeah, so that's the changes in party boundaries and anticipation. Will the SNP have more MPs than Scottish Labour?
I think it's too early to. I think it's too early to say. There is at least a year, I think, until the general election, and we've seen what's happened to Scottish politics since February the 15th, and what's in the UK politics is equally in a state of flux. So anything could happen. But I think both of you are right. I think the Tories will not do as badly as some commentators are suggesting they will. And I think the SNP might do slightly worse than the polls are suggesting. So the Lib Dems will pull off a couple of surprises as always.
You've got the Northeast 5 concentration, Dunbar, not far from where I am, east of Barton. And then in the Highlands and Islands there might be something. Yeah. Although the biggest thing for me considering what to anticipate was that I think it was the Survation, or was it Comres, which showed voters' motivation to actually turn out. And the SNP was 48, 47 in terms of willingness to turn out to vote, which is a shockingly low number. And I thought, even a get out the vote machine politics operation won't work if half of your vote base is saying, well, we don't really feel it. I mean, that's 2017 territory all over again for the SNP, where they lost a whole score of MPs because their vote just wouldn't turn out.
I think
independence is off the table for the foreseeable future. So if you're a loyal nationalist or loyal SNP voter, what's the point in voting if you know perfectly well the core policy is not, is off the table?
I think that's absolutely right, Susan. I think it was something I should have mentioned actually at the start of the discussion. Of course, the other interesting thing about the resignations that we're seeing or that are coming is, of course, it's another indication that independence isn't getting, or another referendum.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, no one would be doing that if they thought that in 3 years or whatever. I get so confused.
In 5 years, yeah.
This plan is, but yeah. In 5 years, in 10 years, there was going to be another referendum.
Yes.
And it's just evidence, I think, that even SNP politicians recognise now that the national conversation is moving on.
Yes.
And I completely agree that if I were an SNP supporter, why would I want to turn out for the SNP at the next general election? If I had a personal loyalty to Nicola Sturgeon, well, she's gone. If I am a diehard independence supporter, well, I mean, even people that aren't the most sensible on this issue know and recognise that it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And if I am purely motivated by wanting to get rid of a Westminster Conservative government, well, I should vote Labour.
Yeah,
so I think they're in a really, really difficult place. And to go back to your original question, Dean, about I think it's right that what we're saying, what Susan mentioned, that Labour could do better, I think, than the polls are suggesting at the moment, because of those issues like turnout and because of those factors that I just don't think there's a reason to vote SNP.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I would think that, but
people will vote next year on the economy and the impact that the cost of living and mortgage interest.
Yeah. Oh, you're breaking up a little bit, Susan.
Oh, sorry, that'll be
I heard mortgage interest, and then you cut out.
Oh, sorry, I was just saying that I think people will vote next year mostly on the cost of living and the economic landscape.
Yeah.
What matters people's own personal household finances and their fears or hopes for the future.
Well, I think that pretty much covers the houses of what we can really say about the parties and where they stand. The other big thing was the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, has decided to go big on changing the conversation in terms of policy debate in Scotland. It had been, I think it was maybe partly, we need to get off of the ferries, we need to get off of the fraud squad inquiries, we need to change the record, I need distance from my predecessor without disavowing her. Drug decriminalisation is a good way to go. And the calculations, perhaps, he knows people like myself, not supportive on the constitutional side for him, but sympathetic, in my case, to decriminalisation as a possibility. So he might put some of us in a very tight spot, where we have to humph and haw. But what can I say about this? My initial reaction with drug decriminalisation was, why now? The timing? and why is it becoming, again, another constitutional bun fight? Because the whole point of a debate around decriminalisation is, you would think intellectually would be war on drugs. Do we really think it's working? Do we think possession of drugs for personal use as a criminal custodial as opposed to an administrative punishment makes us more safe, less safe? What does it do with drug deaths and addiction? Which is a perfectly sensible debate to be had policy-wise, but not if it's in the confines of, oh, Westminster, you're denying us. That's, once again, the whole thing becomes about process rather than outcomes, which I find interminable. I'm so tired of debating process.
Yeah. It's boys playing 3D chess again. So Kevin Pringle, the great strategist who's been in post for a few weeks now, what can we have another fight with Westminster about? What can we say that will be so controversial and create a national conversation that it will take people's attention away from other things like the Crown Office and fraud investigations? But in my personal view, it's completely cynical. It was done during recess. It was done on a Friday afternoon. You never put a major announcement out on a Friday afternoon. And it was done by a junior minister, Elena Whittam. So if the whole debate collapses and the policy needs to be walked back, it's much easier to walk it back if it's a junior minister than if a cabinet secretary or the First Minister had fronted this up. There are 60,000, I think, poly drug users in Scotland. About 30,000 of them are on methadone opioid therapy. There are a debate to be had about whether that works or not. Some evidence suggests it does, others suggest it doesn't. But what we should be having a really serious national conversation is how have we allowed 60,000 people to live such hopeless, chaotic lives, mostly, it has to be said, living in areas of multiple deprivation, that they depend on street heroin or prescribed methadone and benzos, street drugs, which are Valium effectively, to get through their day, and it's killing thousands of people over the last 10 years. That's a conversation we should be having, and it should be about treatment, it should be about rehabilitation, and then it should be about how we support the people as they come out of rehab. And we also should go, what makes a young boy or a young girl, because increasing the number of drug deaths, the number of women are going up, what makes someone have such an awful life that the only way they can get through the day is with street heroin? Now we need to look at what's happening to these children in our schools. What kind of education are they getting? What kind of support are their parents getting? So it's a much bigger picture than some cynical announcement on a Friday afternoon.
Andrew?
Sorry.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Dean, I think that like you, I'm sort of open to this, to the sort of concept and certainly the discussion about this. But I would agree completely with what both of you said about it being a cynical attempt to set up a constitutional clash. I've got kind of two thoughts. One is political, the other's sort of policy related. On the political side, I think that it is a cynical attempt, but I think it's interesting in terms of a wider SNP strategy that they are maybe looking to pivot more. They know, as we said earlier, that independence is dead, and indeed that it's such a low priority that banging on about it is almost a vote loser rather than anything further than that. And I think that they are trying to move now more into a space and possibly anticipating a Labour victory in the general election, where they try and set themselves up as the defenders of devolution and advocates for further devolution of powers, to try and put a Labour government under pressure. Kenny Farquharson had a good piece in the Times about this. So I think that's interesting. I think this is sort of evidence of that, and we've seen it in other areas, and I think we might see it a bit more as well going forward. In terms of the policy, I think Susan's absolutely right. Even if we take that aside, if we take the politics out of it and just think about this from a policy point of view, this is a classic example of the SNP, I think, looking for a silver bullet for a serious issue that has multiple and hugely complex bases, and it's just not a serious way, I think, to do government policy. I mean, the UK government has a lot of flaws, but I think last year, published a 10-year kind of strategy for dealing with drug deaths. And this just seems like it's sort of trying to pull rabbits out of hats to solve what are complex problems. And you're absolutely right, Susan, about deprivation and a lot of the economic issues that are really at the root of this. And so we need a serious and wide-ranging discussion if we're serious about tackling this issue, and not looking at these kind of, if we just change this one thing, then everything will be fine.
Yeah.
It's also very cynical in that effectively personal possession of all drugs, class A, B and C, you just get a pat on the head, basically, since 2021, when Dorothy Bain, the Lord Advocate, said you wouldn't get arrested for a personal possession. And the reality of the drug industry in Scotland is that it is daft young laddies on bikes who bike the individual, stuff around the housing estates, and if they're stopped, all they've got on them is enough to be classed as personal possession, whereas the real dealers, the people who are making all the money, are hidden away from sight, it seems. So it really is cynical, because they know perfectly well that the judicial system in Scotland has effectively decriminalised possession of Class A drugs for the last 2 years. So I hate cynicism in politicians, but I particularly hate cynicism in politics when the victims are people who have absolutely no hope at all, unless, as Andrew says, there is a proper, well-resourced, well-thought-out 10-year plan. I think the US government has just agreed the right to there's Anne-Marie Ward's of Favour UK the Right to Recovery Bill already with the Scottish Parliament that I wish the government would look to support. But the US has just about to invest $50 billion into treatment services for their opioid addiction. So it's treatment. We need to treat people.
Why do you think the Right Recovery Bill has such opposition from the powers that be?
Because it's not an SNP bill. It's as simple as that. Free periods, free period products. You can have all the bright ideas in Holyrood and come up with really well crafted bills and build up huge stakeholder support, but the SNP Green Coalition will not support it unless it's their idea. So they're cynical. It's a terrible way to run a country.
Yeah, and to put for the listeners, I should put some numbers on what the scale of what we're really all talking about here, because when Susan and Andrew talk about the poverty, the death rates, how unacceptable this is, more people in Scotland have died from drug deaths over the last 3 decades than people died in the Troubles in Northern Ireland. To give you a scale of the context, it is that egregious. We're losing that many people.
Yes.
It's absolutely appalling. And in terms of how did we get here, rehabilitation, that angle, I'll give a bunch of numbers that I did put out on Twitter, and I got a lot of grief for pointing out, but I'll point it out again anyway, because I think it's pertinent. If we think of drug deaths, 1996, 244 people died preventably from drug deaths. 2007, the year the SNP took power and devolved Scotland, 455. So there is this trend upwards. 2014, 613 people died. And then 2020, 1,339. So if you look at it on a graph, the spike suddenly goes up through the roof, and it accelerates around about 2007. Now, I would argue it's connected to residential rehabilitation beds. Now, in 2007, Scottish Labour Lib Dem executive, as it was at the time, bequeathed 352 residential rehabilitation beds. And even then, there were waiting lists and things to get into them. How much, in a debate which should be had, is how much of this, even today, is private provision and how much of it's more accessible for lower income people, where there are also needs. Although I'd caution anyone thinking drug addiction, it's poor people. There's a lot of middle class addiction in Scottish society now. But in 2007, 352 residential rehabilitation beds. 2017, 70. 70.
There's your answer.
Causation and causality we can have a debate around that, but I would say they're related. When you have that complete massacring of rehabilitation services in terms of beds, at the same time you see the spike going up. Now, to be fair, just for context, today the number of rehabilitation beds are back up slightly above the 2007 level, but addiction's a long-term thing, and I would argue the damage was done in those first decade of SNP government.
And that makes the whole thing particularly egregious, I think, because in a sense you have the SNP picking a constitutional fight about a horrific, scandalous crisis that's largely of its own making.
Yes.
So it's
totally cynical. Your point, Dean, about middle class drug addiction. There's not a middle class dinner party or wedding or events where there's not queue to the toilets for the coke. But cocaine use amongst professionals in Scotland is regarded completely differently to rake thin young schemies dependent on benzos and methadone. One is perfectly normal society, and the other is seen by the majority of the population as people on the outside. That's a real challenge in terms of trying to get voters to agree that you should actually spend significant amount of public money on helping the 60,000 people in Scotland who desperately need support.
So that brings us to some questions. I'm mindful of time. So that brings us to some very helpful questions, because I had some people in the audience offered questions when I solicited, and a couple of people sent in questions who I quite liked. So we'll start with, let's start with, and of course, Susan and Andrew, they have seen these questions. We did get, we
I
got
don't necessarily have the answers, though.
We could prepare and sound really clever. we're not, this isn't quick fire. How much do you know? We'll start with, let's start with, well, we've already answered it, but to a large extent, but we can summarize it. Christina, who's a long-term listener, Christina from Twitter asks, is this a rather cynical attempt by the SNP to detract from its failure to get a grip of improving, prioritising drug rehab beds after years of underfunding them? I think we've kind of touched on that, but any of you want to say one thing about it?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
Christina, yes.
Is right.
We agree with you. It's there's a clear correlation and causality. It's a homemade problem in devolution here in Scotland. Gail McGregor, who's give her job description, Tory councillor in Dumfries and Galloway, contacted the question: if current laws are the same across the UK, why does Scotland have such a poor drugs deaths rate compared to the rest of the UK? And I thought that's pretty much bang on the money, because we have a uniform drugs approach, and in terms of the law, criminalisation or criminalisation, and wildly different problem between Scotland and England. So what do you put that down to? What's the different factor?
It's worth pointing out that drug deaths in England are starting to rise. I think the figure, I did do a little bit of homework. I think the figure last year, it's up 6% from the previous year, and it's the highest number of drug deaths since records began in 1993. So I think the problem in England, though I am absolutely not an expert, but I think the problem in England, while not as acute as it here in Scotland, I think it is probably going to become worse over the next few years, and particularly given the economic crisis. People feel alienated from society, and I know that critics of that belief say, well, that's no excuse for using heroin, and obviously they have their other issues, but life, if you're living on universal credit, which for a young person is about £250, £280 a month, it's nothing. And you've got no hope. You left school without any qualifications, and you're struggling to get support from your family. It's very easy to get sucked up into a culture where opioids are fully available, where you do a little bit of dealing to make a bit extra money. You know, it's very easy to get sucked into that.
Mhm.
So we just need to be a lot more thoughtful, and a lot, as Andrew has said before, this needs really hard work by policymakers and politicians.
Andrew?
I think that's right. That's the key issue for me, I think. And Dean, you made a good point as well earlier that I hadn't really considered quite in this context. But of course, these are long-term issues. I mean, addiction is a lifelong
Yes.
issue that needs to be managed and wrestled with. And I think that so therefore we need a long-term response. It can't be this short-term thinking. And indeed, as you said, the sort of short-term savings or we'll cut a bit here, those have serious long-term impacts because people then fall through the system. And so I think trying to, and again, I'm not an expert on this, but I think trying to have a longer-term vision, 10-year strategies, thinking about where we are now and where we want to be in a decade is definitely the way, in my view, to manage problems like this. And I think that the reason why there's this differential probably between Scotland and England is just that the SNP the Scottish government took us half the ball on this issue, and we're now, basically a decade ago, and we're now having to deal with the tragic consequences of that.
Because I do remember in the newspapers, I was digging around for the old paper stories that I remembered reading a couple of years ago. And there was I remember in 2019 and 2020, there were the cuts being imposed on rehabilitation services in Glasgow, which is one of the most acute problems in Scotland with drug deaths at the moment, Greater Glasgow and Clyde. And they were warned at the time, the nationalists, if you do this, there will be a consequence. And those consequences were spelled out. So we didn't go into this with our eyes shut. Policymakers had foreknowledge of the potential downside, the financial cuts to rehabilitation services, all the way along the line over the years.
But it's a lot easier. You get much better headlines if you spend tens of millions a year on baby boxes, which are like, cuddly, and they have a little poem in them and saltires and fluffy things, and you're looking after every child in Scotland, when in fact, recent evidence, a report out just recently says they've had absolutely no impact on life chances of children, particularly children in deprived areas. So that money has to come from somewhere. So, cynical politicians will go for the thing they think that will appeal to the biggest number of people and get them the best headlines and the best photo ops.
I've long thought, if I were to sum up the last 16 years, the thought that I always come back to is, if I'm Alex Salmond, Nicola Sturgeon, maybe not so much Humza Yousaf, the jury is still out, let's be fair, but the SNP politicians at the top of who've led their respective governments, excellent at politics, kissing babies, empty platitudes, smiling on camera, weighing in the votes. They've defenestrated Scottish Labour in a way which, when I was a kid, was unthinkable. The birthplace of the Labour movement. Now we're talking about, maybe we'll have 20 MPs if we're really lucky. It's incredible turn of affairs. The political success is immense, but as technocrats pulling levers of power to obtain outcomes on policy, woeful. Absolutely woeful. You could think the person scheme didn't go anywhere. You could think of, what happened to council tax, we still got it. Every major policy that was trumpeted most of them didn't go anywhere over the last 16 years. And that's an abyss. And that's why, with baby boxes, we've talked about this before, Susan, but, that's why I think cynically the former First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, was pushing so hard on gender self-ID and all of that. It was because it was legacy hunting. Dure had a parliament, Salmond had a gold-plated, gold standard referendum, McConnell had the smoking ban, Sturgeon has...
police forensic tents outside our front door.
So legacy chasing. But anyway, that was my cynical 2 cents. We can finish. We suppose we should finish with a quick one from John McTernan.
The famous John McTernan.
The famous. For those who don't know, Blair's political secretary. He also helped strategy and things down in for the Australian Labour Party. He's a man who's he's very, very good at what he does in terms of strategy and communications. I've always liked John. He's well, I'm on a certain wing of the party. I think it's well known I'm not a rabid lefty. So, but John offered a couple of questions that I quite liked. John McTernan asks, find the question here, given around 10% of adults have used drugs recreationally last year, using England and Wales figures, I believe, I checked the source, isn't it time to update the laws around recreational drug use? Now, Susan, you're saying we've already de facto decriminalised drug possession and drug use.
Yes,
to what
we have.
Is that middle class people at dinner parties saying, oh, well, we're okay. Why is it a crime? Isn't this lovely?
Yeah.
And people completely cut off from the realities of life and the schemes.
Yeah. I mean, a wrap of Coke at a middle class dinner party is exactly the same as a bottle of Malbec. I mean, it's.
And so policymakers think, well, if we're okay, we're responsible adults. We can be
responsible adults only do it for the weekends or maybe on a Thursday night if there's something special on. No, it's the schemies, it's the unwashed. I am quoting there, I am not. It is. I lived and worked in Wester Hailes, one of Edinburgh's large housing schemes, for 15 years during the 80s and 90s. So I understand the issues surrounding drug misuse and the conditions that cause it. And it is bloody hard work to try and fix it. It's hard work for the individual who's addicted. It's hard work for the families of the individual. It's hard work for the local community to support drug addicts living within their community. And it's very hard work for the policymakers. They're not prepared to, the policymakers are not willing to expend that hard work and those resources on 60,000 people. Baby boxes are much easier.
Andrew?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I don't have Susan's direct experience, but I'm sure that's absolutely right. And of course, I mean, a lot of these people presumably will be less likely to vote, and it's one of those things. It's just it's a tragedy. Very easy for groups like this to get forgotten, and it plays into a wider point as well. I think that it's not quite directly related to the question, but I'd like to make it anyway, just about the sort of the kind of reputational damage that this SNP scandal has done to Scotland. I mean, one of the statistics I don't think we did mention was that I think this is the worst drugs death rate, certainly in Western Europe, if not in terms of per capita figures. And that's, I think, I mean, you mentioned the 80s there, Susan, as well. It does huge reputational damage, I think, to Scotland internationally to be known for this kind of, and rightly so. I mean, I think because it is a scandal, but it's a really serious issue, and people, as you say, either won't think of the kind of middle class drug users when they think of these things, and so even just if we put aside obviously the main issue, which is the sort of public health implications and bluntly saving people's lives, there are huge other impacts that this failure has, I think, on our place in the world, even our place in the United Kingdom, the way Scotland's perceived, and so it's therefore doubly important, I think, to try and get it resolved properly and seriously.
I remember seeing The Economist a couple of years ago now, when this was really starting to be noticed, despite the scale of it, and they compared the comparison. It was just the fact that it was even the comparison that was made, Scotland and the American opioid crisis. That's the scale of where we are per capita now. It's that bad, and that's the international comparison that magazines like The Economist now put, isn't it? Those are the league tables that we're now in, and it's really appalling. We're the drug death capital of Europe. That's a shameful accolade, and it's decades in the making. And absolutely. So to round this up, then, decriminalisation. Yes, no, not yet. Now's not the time. What's your one line on decriminalisation?
Well, I think my view would be I think there's a discussion to be had about it, but it's not the solution that we need to tackle the issue that we face in Scotland right now, and indeed I think has been brought in out of a cynical attempt to kind of rescue the SNP at a difficult time for them politically.
Susan?
Yeah, I'm pragmatic about it, though the evidence emerging from Portugal, which is decriminalised for quite a few years now, is starting to look as if the policy is not working as well as they thought it would, because shooting up in the street has now become, in some cities like Porto, has now become, a common day occurrence.
Yes, I remember I was reading an article about that to prep, and one of the accounts was outside the cafes, people cannot smoke cigarettes or drink alcohol, but they can light up or they can spark up. And,
exactly.
And you see emaciated people lying on benches and the police just walk past them, shaking their head at them. And it does not seem like it's a solution to anything.
Yeah,
so,
cigarette addiction killed hundreds of thousands of Scots, killed my father, for example. Alcohol addiction destroys thousands of people's lives every day and their families' lives. And drug addiction, similarly. So we really need to look at addiction in Scotland. What makes a happy-go-lucky 11-year-old boy 10 years later is lying on a mortuary slab after having OD'd on methadone and benzos? What happened?
I think it's myriad factors for everything we've talked about, from ingrained poverty, food insecurity, potentially unstable family environments, completely failed rehabilitation and public service provision, economic insecurities and anxieties, the class lens through which poverty consider all of this. Cuts that have been made. I mean, the whole thing is just
And it won't be solved by a cynical announcement on a Friday afternoon by Jim.
And I suppose the consensus is decriminalisation. Sorry, folks, it's not the manna from heaven that the SNP hope it will. We'll finish there now. Before we finish, we'll just very quickly say to the listeners, some people asked me whether we could talk about and comment on the BBC presenter thing. I've chosen not to, because there's not a lot we can see at all about that. There's plenty I would like to see, but there's not a lot I can see. So we will leave it until we can say more.
Can I just say one thing, and it's nothing to do with BBC presenters, it's to do with Ruth Davidson. I have never voted Conservative in my life. I will never vote Conservative. Ruth Davidson is one of the most able, charismatic figures in Scottish public life. It is an absolute honour. It must be for her, and it's a great thing for Scottish rugby that she's now a non-executive director. But we now live in a country where a woman as talented as Ruth Davidson is the victim of a witch hunt by nationalists who do not want her to contribute to our sporting life because of her politics. And I am ashamed that kind of thing happens in my country. Ruth Davidson is a national treasure, and Scottish rugby are very lucky to have her.
Indeed, and I did notice that even a couple of SNP figures, Marcus Carslaw, for example, that I sometimes talk to on social media, even he was he came out with a very blunt tweet about it, say, in response to the Nationals demonisation campaign. I think his tweet was along the lines of, just stop your pish. Just grow up, because even some SNP figures say this is just not helpful. Because as you say, I mean, it's rugby. She's a very good figure, a good fit for the position. So
politics are neither here nor there.
Not everything needs to be about the Constitution, for God's sake. The love of goodness. So anyway, final thoughts, or is that us rounding up? All good? All good. Well, I hope Susan and Andrew enjoyed it as much as I always do.
Yes,
And
I did indeed.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
the enjoyed it as well. We tried to play gracefully with ideas, and as Bertrand Russell always said, one of my favourite writers, angels fly because they take themselves lightly, and it's always good to steel man, not straw man, and I would be great if our politics could go back to that. Anyway, thank you all for joining me.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.